Hello, and welcome to this video about how to practice Soldier's March by Robert Schumann. My name is John Willard, and I'd like to offer you 3 tips in practicing it to make sure you're able to play the piece easier and feel better about it. So there's 3 things you might want to watch out for when practicing this piece. The first one is musical interpretation, and that means A, how do you want the march to sound, and B, making sure the syncopated rhythm you hear is consistent. You have the 1E and the 2, 1E and the 2, or when you play it, 1E and the 2, 1E and the 2. The second point you want to look out for is navigating those shifts in hand position. So when you're moving around on the keyboard from low part to high part in the piece, I'll go over a technique called hovering. And the last part I'd like to go over is contrast and change the dynamics within the musical phrases. So whenever you have 2 phrases that are similar, you might want to think of playing them in terms of call and response or a question and answer to make it a little bit more musically interesting. So with those 3 tips in mind, let's get started. The Soldier's March we'll be working out of is from the Music Tree Part 4 Keyboard Literature book, and we'll be on page 25. So, first point I mentioned was musical interpretation. And that has 2 parts to it, which means the rhythm that you have that's repeated has to be consistent, and also, number 2, how would you want the soldiers to march, or how do you want the march to sound? So, as far as the rhythm goes, it would help you when you practice this piece to be aware of what the repeated rhythm is. So, first you'd want to think of the tempo. How fast is this march going to go? The marking you have in the music is a la Marcia, which basically is in a march style. So it's up to you how fast you want the march to be overall. But main point is to make sure the rhythm is correct. So the rhythm you have is the syncopated rhythm 1E and a 2, 1E and a 2. And just for review's sake and to make sure you're playing it right, it helps to always just make sure you know where those beats fall. In this piece, we have different types of rhythms or different types of note values. What I usually tell my students is when you're trying to figure out a rhythm or counting and clapping something, you always want to use the smallest value of notes that you have in the piece. So in Soldier's March, we have quarter notes, we have eighth notes, we have dotted eighth notes, and we also have sixteenths. So out of those different types of notes, the 16th note would be the smallest value. So I have a little chart here. But first what you would want to do is make sure you subdivide everything. So the smallest value of notes we have again is 16th notes. So if we're in 2/4, how many 16th notes would we need to fill up a measure? So let's write that in. We would need 1, E, and A, and then 2, E, and A. Right? So that's basically subdividing 2/4 and 16th notes. And our main rhythm we have is a dotted 8th note, 16th, 8th note, and then 8th rest. So just to be sure we know where they line up, we know that the first note is always on beat 1. And then how long do we have to hold this dotted 8th note for? So just to review, I have a little chart here. We know that whole note would equal 4 quarter notes, a quarter note equals 2 eighths, and then each eighth note would equal 2 sixteenths. So translating that over here, we know that an eighth note equals 2 sixteenths, so that takes care of the eighth note part, 1E, and then a dot, just to remember, anytime you have a dot on a certain type of note, the dot is half of the value of its note. So if a dot is attached to an eighth note, what's half the value of an eighth note? If an eighth note is 1/8 of a count, then this is 1/16th note, or 16th. So if we have eighth note by itself equals 2 sixteenths, a dot is just 1/16th. Basically, this dotted eighth gets held for 3 16th notes worth. or if you're counting, it would be 1 E and, so that takes care of that. And then this 16th note by itself, that gets the beat of or the last part of the 16th note. So it would be 1 E and 1 E and and then we come to beat 2. So we have 1 E and 2, and then like we said before, an eighth note equals 2/16, so really it's 2 E if you're counting in 16ths. Sorry about this pen. So 1 E and 2, or 1 E and 2 E, and then the rest gets on the and of 2. So that's where that falls. So basically the rhythm is 1 E and 2, and then you have a rest. 1 E and 2. Or if you wanted to do it in eighth notes, 1 and 2, and it would still be 1 and 2. 1 and 2. So just know that anytime you see that rhythm, the dotted eighth, 16th, eighth, you want to make sure it's consistent. And then if you've subdivided it, you know that it falls on the 1, the and the 2. You should be good to go. And then with the rest of the piece, that makes it a lot easier because the eighth notes and the quarter notes you have, they all just fall on the beat. So if you count everything in just 2 beats, 1, 2, 1, 2. So if I play it, for those of you that know the piece, it'd basically be like this. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Alright. So just be aware it's 1, a 2, and then be consistent with that. And then the eighth notes and everything else, eighth notes and quarter notes, they land on the beats, the main big beats.